The rifle bay was quiet except for the distant hum of air circulation and the faint scrape of metal on concrete as she moved one of the weapon racks into alignment. Her hands were small but steady, her motions practiced though she was not a soldier. She had been hired as a civilian assistant, a simple woman who never pretended to be more than she was. Her duty was to keep the space clean, to make sure the weapons were stored properly, to polish away dust, oil the surfaces, sweep the floor, and leave the bay as pristine as the military men demanded. She wore plain work clothes, her hair tied back, her eyes focused on the small things most people overlooked: the tiny smear of grease near a bench leg, the faint powder residue clinging to a corner. It was thankless work, but she took pride in it, finding a kind of calm in the order of steel and silence. It was not her world, not really, but it gave her a place to belong. The men who passed through the bay rarely spoke to her. They were Navy SEALs, hard men with eyes like cut glass and shoulders wide enough to fill a doorway. Their presence made the air itself feel taut, like the space was waiting for action even when all was still. She respected them but never intruded, moving like a shadow between the racks, careful never to be in the way. When they came in, they carried the weight of missions she would never hear about, scars she could not ask about, weapons she dared not touch unless it was her duty to clean and return them to their lockers. She thought of them as giants, untouchable figures who belonged to another world of danger and discipline. And she, just a woman with a cloth in her hand, was an outsider trusted only because she knew how to keep her silence as well as she kept the rifles polished. That morning had been no different at first. She moved quietly with her bucket of oil and rags, placing them at the far bench as she began her routine. She hummed softly to herself, though only under her breath, too faint for anyone else to hear. The racks were lined with M4s, sleek and lethal, each one like an extension of the men who carried them. She wiped along the barrels, careful to check each magazine slot, each sight. It was soothing, the repetition of work, the way her hands seemed to memorize every detail of cold steel. She never imagined anyone noticed her rhythm or her presence at all. To them she was invisible, necessary perhaps but faceless. That was how she liked it. Safety for her meant being unseen. The door hissed open then, heavy boots thudding against the concrete. She froze in place instinctively, rags still pressed against the weapon she was wiping. A tall figure entered, broad shoulders marked by the weight of his tactical vest, the insignia of his unit barely visible under a layer of sweat and dust. His face was unreadable, sharp lines cut deep by years of endurance. His eyes flicked around the bay and then landed on her. She lowered her gaze quickly, expecting him to walk past as they always did. But he didn't. He moved closer, his boots echoing until he stopped just in front of her bench. Without a word, he lifted the rifle from his hands. It was not clean. It was streaked with powder, faint traces of dirt still clinging to its grip, the smell of cordite and earth fresh on its surface. He didn't place it down. Instead, he held it out to her, the weight of the weapon steady between them. She blinked, startled, her hands hovering in uncertainty. No one had ever handed her a weapon directly like that. Usually they left them on the racks, walked away, and expected her to tend to them after. This was different. This was personal. Her heart began to beat faster, though she kept her face calm. Slowly, carefully, she extended her hands and took the rifle from him. It was heavier than she expected, warm still from his grip, alive in a way that made her shiver. She lowered it to the bench, her fingers brushing the worn grip, her breath catching as silence stretched between them. He said nothing, just watched her, his eyes following her movements as though he were weighing something beyond words. She dared not look up too long, afraid of what she might see there. She picked up her cloth and began to work. The first stroke across the rifle's body felt different from all the others she had done before. There was something intimate in knowing this weapon had just been used, that it had been an extension of this man in front of her, that it had been trusted with his life and now, somehow, he was trusting her to handle it. She wiped along the barrel, her hands precise, her mind fighting the strange heat that rose in her chest. The man didn't move. He didn't leave. He stood in silence, his presence heavy, his breathing steady but close enough that she could feel it ripple the air around her. She wondered why he had given it to her directly. Was it respect? A test? Or simply a gesture born out of weariness? She couldn't ask, not here, not with words that felt forbidden. So she let her silence speak, letting her care in the way she handled the rifle show that she understood, that she would treat it, and by extension him, with the reverence both deserved. She worked slowly, each stroke deliberate, each motion carrying the quiet dignity of someone who knew that trust was not given lightly, especially by men like him. When she finally finished wiping the last trace of powder from the weapon, she set it down gently, aligning it perfectly against the bench. Only then did she risk lifting her gaze. His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable, and for a moment she thought she saw something soften in them, just a flicker like a shadow caught between breaths. He gave the faintest nod, nothing more, and then turned away, his boots carrying him back toward the door. The silence he left behind was louder than the slam of gunfire. She stood frozen, her hands still tingling with the ghost of weight, her breath unsteady, her heart whispering a truth she could not name. She lingered at the bench long after he was gone, her rag still in her hand though her work was finished. The echo of his presence remained, a weight in the air that refused to dissipate. She stared at the rifle he had handed her, now spotless and resting with perfect alignment, and wondered what had passed silently between them. It had been only seconds, only a nod, only a transfer of steel from one hand to another. Yet something inside her felt shifted, as if she had crossed an unseen threshold. She shook her head softly, returning to her tasks, convincing herself it was nothing. Just another day, just another weapon. But her hands trembled more than usual as she placed the rifle back into its slot, careful to lock it in place as if it carried a piece of the man who had wielded it. The bay grew quiet again, but her thoughts refused to settle. She swept the floor, her motions mechanical, yet her mind replayed the moment over and over. The way he hadn't spoken, the way he had simply trusted her without question, the way his eyes had lingered. She had been invisible for so long that the sudden spotlight of attention, silent though it was, felt blinding. She tried to tell herself he hadn't meant anything by it. Soldiers were tired after missions. Perhaps it had been easier for him to place the rifle in her hands than to deal with the rack. Still, excuses could not smother the strange burn that remained in her chest. She finished her duties quickly that morning, leaving the bay spotless, but walked out with the unsettling knowledge that tomorrow, if he appeared again, she would not be able to pretend indifference. The following day arrived with gray light spilling across the compound, the smell of damp earth clinging to the air after a night of rain. She arrived early as always, pushing open the heavy door to the rifle bay and letting the metallic scent of oil and steel wash over her. She set down her bucket, arranged her tools, and began her routine. Her hands worked, but her eyes flicked often to the door, against her will, as if waiting for it to open. She scolded herself quietly, focusing harder on polishing the magazines, aligning the stocks, ensuring every surface gleamed. Hours passed, the door stayed closed, and she told herself she was foolish for expecting anything else. But just as she was beginning to relax back into the rhythm of invisibility, the latch turned and he stepped inside. He was alone again, his movements quiet, his expression carved from the same stone she remembered. This time he carried 2 rifles, one in each hand, both streaked with dirt and residue from use. He walked directly to her bench and again, without a single word, extended one of them toward her. She accepted it silently, her heart racing, while he set the second rifle down on the bench with a dull clink of metal on wood. Their eyes met briefly before she lowered hers, heat rushing to her face though nothing had been said. She began to work, her hands steadying as she found the familiar rhythm of cleaning, the cloth moving in careful strokes, the oil catching light as it spread smoothly along the weapon's body. But today he did not simply stand by. He moved to the rack beside her, sliding the second rifle into place once she had finished the first. Then he returned, taking up another from the corner, this one only faintly dirted, and he set it down near her rag and oil. His hand brushed the bench close to hers, deliberate but unhurried, the silence stretching between them like a thread pulled tight. She looked at the weapon, then at him, confused but unwilling to break the unspoken rules of this strange ritual. She cleaned it too, slower this time, aware of how near he stood, aware of his shadow falling across her hands as she worked. It became clear after several minutes that he was helping her, though not in words. Each time she finished with one rifle, he would take it, store it, and replace it with another. Together they moved through the racks, her hands wiping, his hands lifting, an unspoken partnership forged in silence. Neither spoke, yet each seemed to know the rhythm of the other, the cadence of motion as if they had practiced it countless times. The bay, usually so sterile, now pulsed with a strange energy, as if the simple act of cleaning steel had become something heavier, more alive. She tried not to think of the intimacy of it, tried not to let her mind wander to dangerous places, but it was impossible to deny that his quiet presence beside her changed everything. By the time the last rifle was cleaned, her arms ached faintly, though she hardly noticed. He set the final one into its slot, turned, and faced her. For the first time she lifted her gaze fully, meeting his eyes without flinching. There was something there, something she could not name, perhaps even something he could not admit. It was not tenderness exactly, nor command, nor cold detachment. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that went deeper than words. He gave the same faint nod as before, yet somehow it carried more weight now, as though it sealed an unspoken agreement between them. When he left, she stood again in silence, her rag limp in her hand, her breath uneven. She had not spoken a single word, and yet she felt as though she had conversed with him in a language older than speech. Her mind swirled with questions she dared not voice, her chest heavy with the knowledge that something had begun between them, not by choice, not by plan, but by the quiet collision of two lives in a space meant only for steel and order. She knew tomorrow might bring nothing, that he might vanish as suddenly as he had appeared, but she also knew she would not forget. And when the door opened again, whenever it did, she would be ready. The next morning came with a nervous energy she tried hard to ignore. She woke earlier than usual, her sleep broken by fragments of dreams she could not piece together. Dreams of steel, shadows, and eyes that said more than voices ever could. She brushed them away with the routine of her morning, tying back her hair, pulling on her plain work clothes, and packing her small lunch into a worn canvas bag. It should have been like every other day, just another shift inside the rifle bay, but her hands shook faintly as she tied the laces of her boots. She hated that he had gotten under her skin without even speaking. She hated more that part of her wanted it. By the time she walked across the compound, past the lines of concrete buildings and the echo of drills in the distance, her resolve was a fragile thread she carried with her through the bay's heavy door. The familiar scent of oil and metal embraced her as she stepped inside. She placed her tools on the bench, arranged everything with practiced precision, and began to clean. She focused on the rhythm, wipe, oil, polish, align, trying to anchor herself in the motions that had always steadied her. Yet her eyes betrayed her, glancing at the door every few moments. She hated the anticipation, the way it coiled in her chest, but she could not stop. Minutes passed. Hours. The door remained shut, the silence thick. By midday, she told herself he was not coming, and a strange mix of relief and disappointment tugged at her heart. Perhaps it had only been a fleeting coincidence, a passing habit. Maybe she had been foolish to think it meant anything more. But then the latch clicked. The sound froze her hand mid-stroke, the cloth hovering above the barrel of a rifle. The door opened and he stepped inside once more. He was different today, not in his bearing, which was still solid and silent, but in the way his eyes swept the room before settling on her. He carried no weapons this time. His hands were empty, his stride measured. He came directly to her bench, stopping close enough that she could feel the faint current of his presence, but he did not hand her a rifle. Instead, he placed a small strip of cloth on the bench, folded neatly, marked faintly with streaks of dirt and oil. It was his cleaning rag, she realized. Not military issue, personal, worn soft by use. He left it there without explanation, his hand lingering a second longer than necessary before pulling away. Her breath caught as she looked down at it. The rag was nothing really, just fabric stained and frayed. But in the silent language they had built, it was everything. A gesture, an offering, perhaps even a kind of trust. She glanced up at him, her eyes searching his for meaning, but as always, his face was unreadable. Still, something flickered in his gaze and she felt the ground tilt beneath her. She nodded faintly, unsure if he even wanted a response but needing to give one. He inclined his head slightly, the barest acknowledgement, then turned and walked toward the racks. This time he didn't simply wait for her to work. He began to move along the rows, his large hands adjusting rifles, checking locks, aligning them with a precision that mirrored her own habits. She watched him for a moment, caught off guard. She had always thought of the bay as her world, her order, her sanctuary, while the men came and went only as users of the space. But now, as he worked alongside her, it felt different, shared. Without speaking, he had stepped into her rhythm, folding himself into it as if he belonged there. She picked up the rag he had left, holding it between her fingers for a long moment before setting it beside her tools, almost reverently, and resuming her own cleaning. They moved together in silence for what felt like hours. She polished rifles, he carried them, shifted racks, tightened fittings. They passed close, sometimes so near that her shoulder brushed his arm, sending jolts through her body she fought to conceal. Neither of them broke the quiet. Words would have ruined it, she realized. What they had built lived in silence, in the weight of glances and the precision of motion. The bay no longer felt like just a place of steel and duty. It felt alive, transformed by a current that flowed between them, subtle but undeniable. At one point she bent low to scrub a stubborn mark from the floor near the bench, her knees pressing into the concrete. She felt rather than saw his eyes on her, steady, unblinking. The awareness of his gaze made her chest tighten, but she did not look up, did not break the moment. She kept working until the stain was gone, then rose slowly, her rag streaked dark. When she finally dared glance at him, his expression had not changed, yet she knew he had been watching, waiting. Something passed between them again, wordless, heavy, alive. By the end of the shift, the bay was immaculate, the rifles gleaming, the racks perfectly aligned. He stepped closer to her, his shadow stretching across the bench. For a long moment he simply stood there, as though searching for something in her face. Then, as before, he gave that subtle nod, but this time he left his rag on the bench when he turned to go. She looked down at it once more, her fingers trembling as she touched the worn fabric. It was meaningless to anyone else, a scrap of cloth. But to her it was proof that she was no longer invisible, that she had been seen, acknowledged, drawn into the orbit of a man who spoke with silence instead of words. When the door closed behind him, she sat on the bench, holding the rag in both hands. Her heart raced, her mind buzzing with questions she dared not voice. She didn't know why he had chosen her, why he had broken the unspoken distance that usually separated men like him from people like her. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the bay would never feel the same again. Tomorrow, when the door opened, she would be waiting, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty that something was growing in the spaces where words could not reach. She did not sleep that night. The rag he had left remained on her bedside table, folded neatly, though she had unfolded and refolded it more times than she could count. It carried his scent faintly: oil, metal, dust, and something else, something that felt like the edge of battle lingering in cloth. It was absurd, she told herself. Just a scrap of fabric, nothing more. And yet she could not let it go. She lay awake listening to the hum of the compound outside her small quarters, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he thought of her at all, or if she was just a passing shadow in his day. The doubt gnawed at her, but so did the memory of his silence, his eyes, the deliberate act of leaving behind something personal. By morning, exhaustion pulled at her, but it didn't matter. She dressed with unusual care, as though he might notice the neatness of her hair, the smoothness of her sleeves, though deep down she knew such details meant nothing to a man like him. Still, she carried the rag back into the bay with her, folded in her pocket like a secret. The bay welcomed her with the same familiar stillness. She began her work, though today her hands were restless, her mind clouded with expectation she tried to bury under routine. Each rifle she cleaned, each surface she polished, was done with a touch more care than usual, as though she were preparing the space not just for order, but for him. Hours stretched. The door remained closed. Her chest grew heavier with each passing moment. Perhaps she had imagined too much, read too deeply into what had only been habit or coincidence. But then, just as she lowered her rag in quiet resignation, the latch clicked and the door opened. He entered without hurry as always, though this time there was a subtle shift in his bearing. His vest was off, his uniform lighter, sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It made him look less like a shadow of war and more like a man, though no less formidable. He carried no rifle again, only himself, and as he walked to her bench she realized with a sudden twist in her stomach that he had come not for weapons, but for her. He stopped before her, close enough that she felt the warmth of his body in the cool air of the bay. His eyes dropped briefly to her hands, then lifted to meet hers. The silence was thick, electric, but not uncomfortable. She waited, breath caught, as though the whole room held itself still. Without speaking, he reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out something small. He placed it gently on the bench in front of her. A bullet casing, brass and worn, its surface darkened by use. It was nothing remarkable, yet the way he set it down gave it weight beyond measure. She stared at it, then at him, unsure what to do. Slowly, she picked it up, feeling the cool metal against her skin, turning it between her fingers. The casing had been fired, spent, emptied of purpose, yet he had kept it. And now, without words, he was giving it to her. Her chest tightened, a strange heat rising behind her eyes. She wanted to ask why, to demand what it meant, but the rules they had built held her silent. Instead, she nodded, small but firm, her hand closing around the casing like it was something fragile and irreplaceable. His gaze lingered on her face, steady, unreadable, though softer than before. He did not nod this time. Instead, he leaned one hand on the bench beside hers, lowering his head slightly, as though closing the space between them without truly bridging it. The silence was louder now, heavy with things unspoken. She felt her breath catch, her body tense, but she did not step back. She held her ground, eyes locked to his, heart thundering so violently she was certain he could hear it. The moment stretched long and she thought he might finally speak, break the ritual of quiet that bound them. But instead he straightened, removed his hand and stepped back. He moved to the racks then, lifting a rifle with smooth ease and setting it down before her. She took it automatically, her fingers still trembling from the weight of the casing in her pocket. She began to clean, falling into the rhythm, but everything was different now. He stayed close, moving with her, watching with a presence that was not merely supervision. He carried rifles, replaced them, but his eyes rarely left her. Each glance was a conversation, each silence a statement. She understood now that words were unnecessary between them. Everything they needed was said in the weight of metal passed from one hand to another, in the stillness of shared space, in the gifts of fabric and brass. When the last rifle was polished, when the racks were perfect again, he did not leave immediately. He stood by the door, his hand resting on the frame, watching her as though trying to memorize her shape against the glow of the bay. She held his gaze this time, not dropping it, not hiding. Something in her had shifted, grown bolder under the shelter of silence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he gave that same small nod, and then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the distance. She sat on the bench, her hand slipping into her pocket, fingers curling around the bullet casing. The rag lay folded beside her, waiting, but it was the casing that pressed into her palm, solid and undeniable. She closed her eyes, letting the weight of it ground her, letting it remind her that she was no longer invisible. He had chosen her, somehow, in a way that defied logic or reason. And though the world outside the bay might never notice, inside these walls a story was being written wordlessly, in fragments of cloth, brass, steel, and silence. She had no idea where it was leading, no map to follow, but for the first time in her life she was not afraid of the unknown. She would wait. She would see. And when the door opened again, she would be ready to meet his silence with her own. The days that followed fell into a rhythm unlike any she had ever known. Each morning she stepped into the rifle bay with the quiet certainty that he would appear. Sometimes he came with weapons, their steel warm from use, sometimes with nothing at all but his presence, and always with the silence that had become their language. They worked together without speaking, moving in tandem as though the space had been built for them alone. She learned the sound of his boots against the concrete, the subtle shift of his breath when he stood close, the weight of his gaze when she bent over a rifle. He never rushed her. He never commanded. Yet his presence reshaped her world entirely. She felt alive in a way she had never dared to imagine. Seen, chosen, tethered to something deeper than the boundaries of her simple life should have allowed. The bullet casing never left her pocket. She carried it always, even when she was outside the bay, her fingers brushing its edge whenever doubt crept into her mind. It grounded her, reminded her that what was happening was real, even if no one else would ever see it. The rag too she kept close, tucked safely among her tools. Symbols, perhaps, meaningless to others, but to her they were threads woven into a bond that was growing stronger each day. She wondered if he thought of them as gifts or simply habits, but the truth was in the way he lingered, the way his silence bent toward her like a compass seeking true north. One evening, long after she should have left the bay, she found herself sitting on the bench, staring at the rows of rifles gleaming in perfect order. The light above flickered softly, the air still. She thought about him, where he was now, what kind of missions he walked into, what kind of dangers he faced that she would never know. The thought twisted her chest. She had no right to care, not really. She was just a woman with rags and oil, and he was a soldier forged in shadows. Yet she cared all the same. Her fingers curled around the casing in her pocket until it pressed hard into her skin, a reminder that for reasons beyond understanding, he had chosen to let her hold a piece of his world. The next morning he came again. This time his uniform bore fresh marks, scuffs of dirt across his sleeves, a faint smear of dried blood at the edge of his collar. Her heart clenched at the sight, though she kept her face calm, her hands steady. He walked toward her bench, carrying a rifle that looked harder used than any before, streaked dark along the barrel. He placed it down gently, then stepped back, his eyes on her as though waiting. She took it carefully, feeling the weight of it as if it carried the echoes of violence and survival. She cleaned it with unusual care, each stroke of the rag slower, more deliberate, her breath shallow as she imagined the places it had been only hours ago. He stood close, silent as always, but she felt the heaviness of the moment settle between them like an unspoken truth. His life was bound to these weapons, and by tending to them she was touching the edge of his battles, the line between life and death. When she finished, she set the rifle aside, her hands trembling faintly despite her efforts. She looked up at him then, unable to hide the question in her eyes, Are you hurt? Are you whole? Are you safe? He must have seen it, because for the first time his expression shifted, the hard stone softening just slightly. His gaze held hers longer than ever before, and in that silence she felt the answer. He was here. He was alive. And in some unexplainable way he was giving that truth to her. He reached into his pocket again and her breath caught. When he drew his hand out, he placed something small on the bench, a patch frayed at the edges torn from his uniform. It was simple, faded, but it carried the mark of his unit, the weight of belonging to a brotherhood she could never enter. He left it there, his fingers brushing the bench so close to hers that the air between them vibrated. She stared at the patch, her chest aching, and then lifted it with careful fingers. The fabric was rough, still warm from his hand. She closed her eyes briefly, pressing it to her palm, and when she opened them again, his eyes were on her, steady and searching. That moment stretched until it felt eternal. He leaned forward slightly, his hand bracing on the bench, his face closer than it had ever been. Her pulse thundered, her lips parted though no words came. She could feel his breath, warm, steady, carrying the scent of earth and steel. For one suspended instant she thought he might cross the boundary at last, close the space, break the silence. But instead, he straightened slowly, his eyes lingering on hers, and gave the faintest nod. Then he turned, his boots echoing as he walked away, leaving her trembling in the wake of everything unsaid. When the door closed, she sat for a long time, the patch cradled in her hands. The rag, the casing, the patch, each one a fragment, a piece of him entrusted to her. She didn't know why he chose her, why he broke the wall of distance with these silent gestures, but she knew she could no longer deny what it meant. The rifle bay was no longer just a place of duty. It was a place of meeting, of something building quietly in the spaces between them. And though fear stirred in her chest, fear of what it might cost, of what it might mean, there was a fiercer truth beneath it. She wanted more. The next morning was gray, heavy clouds rolling in from the sea, and the entire base seemed wrapped in a strange silence. Anna woke early, her body still carrying the fatigue of the previous night, but her mind was restless. She replayed the conversation she had had with the SEAL, the way his words had carried weight without ever being dramatic. He wasn't a man who spoke much, yet everything he said lingered like an echo. She prepared herself quickly, tied her hair back, and made her way to the rifle bay, the place that had become strangely important to her, not just for work but because it was where this unusual connection had begun. When she arrived, the SEAL was already there, standing at the far end of the room, cleaning a rifle with slow, deliberate movements. He looked up when she entered, his expression unreadable, though his eyes acknowledged her presence. Anna walked in quietly, set down her things, and began her work without a word. The silence was not awkward, it was steady like the pause before a storm. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the clink of metal, the scrape of brushes, the soft shift of boots on concrete. Then he broke it. You wonder why I gave you that weapon. His voice was low, almost drowned by the rain that had begun to patter against the windows. Anna paused, her hands stilling over a case of cartridges, and looked up at him. She hadn't expected him to mention it so directly. Yes, she admitted softly. I wondered. It didn't feel like a mistake. He nodded once as if her answer was enough, but then set the rifle aside and leaned back against the table. Trust isn't given easily. For us it can mean life or death. You didn't hesitate. That told me something. His words were simple, but Anna felt the weight of them settle inside her chest. She hadn't done anything extraordinary, not in her eyes, she had just reacted. Yet to him it seemed to mean more. The conversation shifted as thunder rumbled outside. He asked her questions, not many but pointed ones. Where she grew up. Why she had taken the job on the base. What she thought about being surrounded by soldiers who carried the kind of burdens most people never saw. Anna answered honestly, her voice steady though inside she felt exposed, as if each word revealed a piece of her she usually kept hidden. He listened carefully, never interrupting, his gaze steady. She realized he wasn't just hearing her words, he was studying the spaces between them. In return he offered fragments of himself. He spoke about deployments, never in detail, but in the kind of broad strokes that hinted at shadows behind the surface. You see things you don't forget, he said once, his tone quiet but firm. You carry them. Doesn't matter if you want to or not. Anna didn't press for more. She could sense the walls around him, but she also saw the cracks, small glimpses of the man beneath the soldier. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof, filling the room with a constant rhythm. Anna found herself feeling strangely calm in his presence, as though the storm outside made the quiet between them more intimate. She worked beside him, her hands steady, while her mind circled the strange truth of it all. That a woman who had come here simply to keep things tidy was now being drawn into the confidence of a man whose life was defined by secrecy and survival. At one point he set down his tools and looked at her directly. "You ever shoot?" The question startled her. She shook her head. "Never. I've only seen rifles in my father's old cabinet back when I was a kid. I don't even think I touched one." His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile but something close. "Maybe one day you should." The thought made her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the awareness of what he was suggesting, not casually but deliberately. She wasn't sure if she wanted that, yet a part of her knew she might not refuse him if the time came. She had the sense that everything he offered was both a test and a gift, and she was beginning to understand that neither came without meaning. The hours passed, and when the storm finally began to break, the rifle bay smelled faintly of oil and steel, its walls echoing with a silence that felt fuller than any conversation. As she gathered her things, Anna felt his presence behind her. "You'll see me again tomorrow?" he said, not as a question but as a certainty. She met his eyes, nodded once and left, her heart carrying the echo of his voice like a promise. That night, she lay awake in her small quarters, listening to the rain taper into silence. Her thoughts refused to rest. She wasn't in love, at least she didn't think so, but something inside her had shifted. There was gravity pulling her toward him, a gravity she didn't want to resist. She thought of his eyes, of the way his words carried more than they said, and she realized that this quiet bond between them was becoming the most real thing in her life. She drifted to sleep with a strange peace, knowing tomorrow would bring him again, and with him whatever weight he chose to place in her hands. The days that followed carried an odd stillness, as though the base itself was holding its breath. Lena felt it in the way the corridors seemed quieter, in the way conversations hushed whenever she passed, in the way the seals kept appearing at the edges of her work without ever explaining why. She had grown used to their presence now, the silent watching, the way they seemed to study her not as a threat but as a piece of a puzzle they couldn't yet name. And then there was him, the seal who had first handed her his rifle. He had no name, at least none she was told, but Lena found her thoughts circling him with strange persistence. She remembered the weight of his weapon in her hands, the unspoken trust that simple act had carried. He had not spoken a word, but his silence had been louder than any command. He trusted her. Or perhaps he was testing her. The thought replayed endlessly, and every time she polished another rifle or swept the bay, her mind returned to him. She could picture his gloved hands, the exact tilt of his head when he regarded her, the way his gaze cut through the space between them. He was a man who had spent his life in the shadows of war, yet somehow, in that single gesture, he had acknowledged her as part of his world. It unsettled her because Lena was no soldier. She was just a simple woman who had come to the base for work, to clean and keep the place in order. Her life had never touched the edges of danger beyond the stories she heard in the mess hall or the faint echo of gunfire during training drills. And yet, the moment she accepted that rifle, a shift occurred. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just a woman tidying up after men. She had stepped, unknowingly, into something larger, and the air around her felt charged with consequences. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the base in amber light, Lena lingered longer than usual. The rifle bay was empty, the racks gleaming after her careful polish. She was about to lock up when the door creaked open. Her breath caught when she saw him. The same seal, the same unreadable mask of silence. He stepped in with measured calm, the kind of controlled grace that made even walking seem dangerous. He didn't speak. He never did. Instead, he set his weapon on the counter as he had before and simply watched her. Lena's hands moved on instinct. She reached for the rifle, cradled it carefully and began her work. The silence between them was thick but not hostile. It was alive, pulsing with unspoken things. She polished, checked, adjusted, her every movement deliberate, respectful. She could feel his eyes on her, heavy, piercing, as though he were peeling back her layers. At one point, her fingers brushed the stock, and she imagined for a fleeting second that the rifle was not just a weapon but a message, a bridge between worlds. When she finally placed it back before him, she dared to glance up. Their eyes met. He gave the slightest nod, barely perceptible, but in that small gesture was something vast. Approval. Respect. Perhaps even gratitude. And then, as silently as he had come, he turned and left, the door clicking softly behind him. That night Lena could not sleep. Her thoughts whirled, tangled between fear and curiosity. What did he see in her? Why her? When there were dozens of others on the base. She was no fighter, no strategist. She had no rank or uniform. Yet his silence bound her tighter than words ever could. She found herself waiting, even yearning, for the next time he would appear. And he did. Again and again, always at odd hours, always without speaking. Each time he placed his weapon in her hands, each time she cared for it with the same steady devotion, the bond deepened. It was not romance, not yet, but something more primal. A recognition between two souls that lived in different worlds but brushed against each other through the simplest of acts. Lena felt herself drawn into his orbit, and though she knew nothing about his missions, his battles, or his scars, she began to feel the weight of his silence as though it belonged to her too. The others noticed. Whispers followed her in the halls. Some called it strange, others called it foolish. A few warned her quietly, "Don't get too close, don't let them pull you in." The seals lived in shadows, and those who touched shadows often lost themselves. Lena heard their warnings, but her heart ignored them. She wasn't blind. She knew she was walking a fine line, but something inside her refused to step back. One evening, when she was once again alone in the bay, she caught herself staring at the rack of rifles, imagining his hands, his presence. She realized then that her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a woman who tidied the rifle bay. She was part of something she didn't yet understand, and the path ahead was hidden, dangerous, but irresistible. And in the quiet hum of the base at night, Lena whispered to herself a truth she could no longer deny. She wanted to see where it would lead. The morning after the unexpected embrace of silence between Clara and the seal carried an unusual weight. She woke earlier than usual, the faint scent of oil and metal lingering in her memory, as if it had been woven into the very threads of her dreams. She moved through the base with her usual quiet grace, sweeping floors and dusting corners no one else noticed, but today everything felt sharpened, as though every sound carried more meaning. Her broom whispered across the tiles like a secret, and every clink of boots on concrete reminded her of the night before. The SEAL team, stoic as ever, moved with their purposeful precision. No one addressed her directly, they rarely did. But when Clara passed the rifle bay, she saw him, the same SEAL, standing where he had been yesterday, the faint outline of his broad frame caught in the early light. For a moment she thought he wouldn't look her way, and perhaps that was what she expected. But he did. Just slightly, only enough for her to see his eyes acknowledge her presence. There was no smile, no gesture, nothing extravagant. But that glance carried the same weight as his silent handover of the rifle. It was as if he'd said, "I remember you. You mattered in that moment." Clara's heart picked up a rhythm she couldn't entirely control. She kept sweeping, letting the natural rhythm of her work ground her, but the memory kept looping in her mind. It wasn't love, not yet, maybe not ever. It was something rarer, respect, recognition, the breaking of a boundary that most people like her never even had the chance to approach. She was no soldier, no strategist, no fighter. She was a woman who tidied up messes. And yet, somehow, a weapon that had crossed oceans of battlefields had rested in her hands because a man who had given his life to danger decided she was steady enough to hold it. Later that afternoon, Clara found herself repairing a loose storage crate near the vehicle bay. Her hands worked methodically, tying the rope, testing the knot, adjusting the weight. She didn't notice the SEAL walking by until his shadow stretched across her workspace. She froze, unsure whether to rise, greet him, or keep her head down. But before she could choose, he crouched down, checking the knot she had just tied. His gloved hand tugged at it, testing its strength. He gave a single nod, almost imperceptible, then looked at her as if to say good work. Then without a word he moved on. Clara sat there, stunned, her pulse quickening. That simple gesture felt more valuable than a medal. He had acknowledged her skill, not just her presence but her usefulness. For years she had lived under the weight of invisibility. People saw the broom, the bucket, the uniform, but not her. She was background, someone who slipped in and out of places without being remembered. But this man, hardened by war, saw her for more than that. He had trusted her with his rifle, and now he had trusted her not. Small things, maybe, but they were building into something undeniable. That night, the camp was quieter than usual. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. They were calloused from work, rough from cleaning chemicals, yet steady. She thought about how they had held his weapon, tied the rope he approved of, swept the floor that bore his footsteps. She realized something deep and powerful. Her life might never be grand, but it mattered in ways she had never measured before. The SEAL had shown her that worth isn't always in titles, but in the steadiness you carry into the world. When she lay down, she closed her eyes and thought of the silence they shared in the rifle bay, the nod by the storage crates, the glance in the morning light. She thought of the way the unspoken connection between them grew with each passing day, Not in words but in quiet actions. It wasn't romance. It wasn't friendship. It was something more elusive, a recognition of spirit between two people whose lives had no reason to touch, yet did. As days stretched into weeks, Clara carried herself differently. She moved with more quiet confidence, knowing she wasn't invisible anymore. She still swept, still dusted, still repaired small things. But every so often, in the corner of her eye, she would catch a glance of him. The SEAL never spoke much, but he didn't need to. She understood now that some bonds don't require words, only trust. And in the unlikeliest of places, a simple woman in a base filled with warriors, a broom against a sea of rifles, Clara discovered that her life carried more strength than she had ever believed. She realized that sometimes the most profound respect is not shouted, not even spoken, but handed over in silence, like a weapon trusted to steady hands. It was enough. More than enough. The end.